Hi everyone. I'm an artist, and this is me in my studio in Hackney Wick. And I don't know anything about computers, and I'm not hardly going to barely mention them. I'd make everything by hand, and it's either drawn or sculpted. That's a dog I made out of papier-mâché called Tricky Dog, and this is all the stuff that I use to make it. I make some big heads, Zuckerberg. There's another papier-mâché one. And little tiny sweet little doggies. And sometimes wall hangings. I use a lot of plasticine. I don't know if you remember plasticine from when you were a kid. It's a bit like Play-Doh. And this is a rough I made. So, that was a rough for this sculpture I made for my friend Dawn. It was for her birthday, and that's the actual Dawn. So you see, it really wasn't much of an exaggeration at all. When I was a kid, I used to love these kind of races from around the world type spreads. I'm not sure how PC they are really now, or whether races is really a kind of acknowledged concept so much anymore. But I loved all these different faces. And that was just a little quote I saw. You know, Aesop cosmetics. This is just a little quote on the side of an Aesop bag, but I thought it was quite profound, really. The flesh is the surface of the unknown. So I do portraits, and I'm always wondering, really, how much you can tell about someone from a portrait, from their skin, from how they look. Angela Merkel, for instance, a very mysterious person in a way. That's my sculpture of her. I just wanted to make her look a little bit twinkly and cheeky, because normally she's so incredibly measured and calm and quite dour. Our own Prince William. All that anyone's interested in him really is his baldness. So I did this talking to his little son. There's all these pictures of him leaning over his son as they just walked out the plane, on the tarmac. And I thought it's such an odd image. Caster Semenya, she's an athlete that's very controversial because of testosterone levels and things like that. But she's very beautiful and amazing looking. And that was a plasticine head I made of her. So I do all sorts of portraits. And it's something I think that's kind of run through me from a very early age. That's me as a kid, sitting in my the summer house at the end of the garden. My grandma gave me a set of tools, which I started making things with like this. This is my first ever sculpture of a robot. And I used to do this sort of lettering, which is kind of like turning letters into faces. This is my dad. He was a natural history illustrator, and this is one of his pictures. And I came from a sort of quite heavy-duty art family, totally different from Burton, talking just before me. I kind of slid into art as the obvious thing to do, with no opposition from my parents. No, it was really the lazy option. But this was my what my dad did, and I realized the other day, actually, he did portraits of frogs. So I'm really even more going along sort of family lines. This is his studio, which was an utter tip. He was a hoarder, and we were going through it the other day, and I found this on the floor that I remember had a big impression on me. It was a kind of medical book with some sort of ghoulish photos of herpes and syphilis and things like that. And it rather reminded me of these sort of images that were found on Francis Bacon, the English painter's Francis Bacon's floor. That's Francis Bacon. Do you know who Francis Bacon is? He is an English painter in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, up until 80s. He did amazing portraits like this. And I think as a teenager, he's almost a bit of a typical teenage fixation type artist, but I was almost as fascinated by his face as I was his work, because he's got such a spooky face. He's brilliant in interviews. If you ever fancy looking up an old English artist on interviews, have a look at Francis Bacon. Camp as tits, I can't tell you. As a teenager, I got out these books. One, Francis Bacon, David Hockney. I remember my mum and my grandma kind of whispering to each other as, there was gay trouble ahead. I didn't even know what I was, it was just a natural thing for me to be drawn to these two artists. Later, I've got to know the author of the David Hockney book, Marco Livingstone, and that's his drawing of me. And that's another drawing of me by Marco, terribly out of proportion, of course. So this is what I'm asking myself when I'm doing a portrait, really. It's what is the basics? I can almost make a note like ears sticking out, eyes too close together, bald, whatever the things are. There's a kind of list of features to keep in mind when I'm doing a portrait. So this is my friend Prosper that I play badminton with. And that's my portrait of him, which I thought was quite successful. My friend Jason. And that's my portrait of Jason. This was a bit of a lesson, this one, because I'd done it and I showed it to him at a party, and he said, "Oh yeah, great. I really like the way you've simplified it, and it's got something of me, but it's very refined the way you've done it." And I thought, "Oh great, that's quite a success." Then about an hour later, after he'd had a few drinks, he came up to me and said, "But it's not very sexy, is it?" And I said, "Well, I wasn't really what I was aiming at. That wasn't my primary consideration to make you look sexy, but it made me realize that hardly anyone wants to look funny or peculiar or daft. They want to look cool, sexy, and great." This is my friend's baby, Cecily. And that's the portrait I did of Cecily, which went down really badly. I've hardly been able to make it up with my friend Dave since doing this portrait. I wanted to do that, when that thing where babies are just on the cusp of either crying or laughing, or or making a sort of enjoyable gurgle or a scream. But anyway, it didn't work. That's Justin Bieber. Just a little bit of a thought. The philosopher Plotinus questioned having his portrait done. His face wasn't him, he said, but merely his husk. A portrait would therefore be a husk of a husk, an illusion doubled. So every so often I get jobs to sculpt people. This is someone called Wolfgang Joop, who I assume is German. He invented the perfume called Joop. And he's obviously a queen who's had far too much facial surgery. And I was worried about doing this portrait, and that it might, it might not go down well. But he was. I did a whole series for a magazine, and he was the only one who loved it and retweeted it. So you can never tell what people's reactions. This was the magazine, which is one of these massive, thick fashion magazines that you just cannot understand how it survives, really. Costing about 25 quid or something. I don't know what it is. Super thick, couple of adverts. It must be somebody's sort of vanity project. But anyway, this is Dolce and Gabanna. This one was banned from the magazine because Dolce and Gabbana are so touchy, apparently. Fendi and Lagerfeld. This one went down fine. And I like this. Who's Muccia Prada? That's it. I thought she looked quite peasant, like a sort of Italian peasant, which I thought came an elegant Italian peasant. These are all made out of plasticine. I thought this is just such a sweet quote. "I've always tried to hide my efforts and wished my works to have a light joyousness of springtime, which never lets anyone suspect the labors it has cost me." So that's from Matisse, and if you know Matisse's work, it's amazingly elegant and swiftly painted, and his drawings sometimes are just about 3 or 4 lines. And I would love to do the same thing. I'd love to work on something so that I can get quick at doing a drawing or a sculpture, and plasticine's pretty good because it's such an immediate sort of material. This is another job I had for Barcelona, just doing a few heads for Barcelona Design Week. That is Zaha Hadid, and that's Sigmund. Now, who is it? I haven't put it in my presenter notes, but it doesn't matter. He's a philosopher. And I did this Bermont Sigmund, or Sigmund Bermont, or something like that. I made him, and they were filming it and going to put music with it and stuff like that. And I sort of did this as a kind of little bit of a funny little old man. But they put this rather sort of ethereal music behind it, which I thought was a bit crazy. Oh, there he is. Oh, is that just going to go on and on? Well, anyway. But I also did this one, which was of David Bowie, and I thought this one worked much better. Yeah, so it's lovely when I do something as simple as a plasticine head, but if it's a commission thing, somebody else takes it into, just all they did, obviously, is just turn it like that, add a bit of music, but it becomes something else, which is lovely. Something I really like doing is plasticine workshops. So I just get a whole load of people together, and I do very little. I provide them with plasticine and just get them to make heads of each other. And some of them are absolutely great. These are, when people get to grips with hair, this woman did her boyfriend. That's one. Do you know Mr. Bingo? Mr. Bingo's always talking at these sort of things. Good friend of John's. That was one I did of him, actually, but he demanded a cock as a nose, and it was a pleasure to apply it. That's another one I did of Bingo with extra red ears that he liked and actually bought. And he put it on Instagram and compared himself to Mrs. Thatcher, which was pretty good. Another very inscrutable face. I like this portrait I saw of her. That's just a tiny bit off in some way. It's very hard to see. Slightly flattened or something, or her hair's sort of tiny bit off. I spent hours looking on eBay for drawings and paintings. I love this pretty boy with his pussy. This sort of life drawing, it's always the common problem with life drawing is making the hands and feet too small. That's a real obvious one. This worked well as a pair, I thought. I used to work for this magazine, Raw Vision, about outsider and self-taught art. I think the term is slightly changing now. I think it may be going to be called neurodiverse art, but that's always been a big thing for me. I used to partly design the magazine and go and interview and photograph artists, especially in the southern United States. This is someone called S.L. Jones, so I particularly love his sculptures. And this is son Ford Thomas. He was a grave digger, and he dug clay and made heads, and the hair and the glasses and sometimes teeth that you see on his sculptures are taken from the bodies. That's real human teeth, a particularly spooky one. Other heroes of mine were working in Berlin in the 20s. Right, now, I really hesitate before speaking any German, but have you heard of the movement called the Neue Sachlichkeit? New objectivity. How do you say it properly? Whoa, I won't even try, but it's, yeah. A lot of my heroes actually were working here, so I'm longing on the weekend to go and see. I think there's a good museum of Berlin art, so it should have had a lot of these people. This is someone called George Gross, and this is someone called Otto Dix, who did these amazing paintings between the wars. They're sort of satirical paintings of the way Germany was at that time, or Berlin perhaps was, very decadent, but they're cutting, biting satirical works. But there's also a sort of a humor about them, and also literally the way they're drawn is so great. That's someone called Jean Mammon who did that painting. There was a great show in the Tate recently. Right, another thought. Research at Princeton University has revealed that a reading of 1/10 of a second is enough for us to decide whether we trust or mistrust a face, a mere Tinder swipe. It is this elementary social wiring that makes portraiture the most basic of all the genres of the visual arts. So I'm often worrying in a way that I'm doing something that is so well trodden, and it's been done so many times, so brilliantly by so many other people. What can I add to it? And I don't know. I've got a good answer to that, apart from I'm drawing contemporary people in my own way the best I can. But this thing about whether you trust a face, I think is very interesting. That's Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a serial killer. So if you saw him walking down the street, would you think that's someone who looks a bit suspicious, or would you think that's rather a good-looking guy? I think it's very hard to know just from someone's face. This is a pilot who you probably remember flew his plane into a mountain. They're always going to. You're always going to want to see. They're always going to put the face of the person who's done some sort of horrible massacre. Maybe the early editions of the newspaper just have the headline. They haven't got the face, the picture of the person yet. But you always want to see. You always want to have a look and say. And really, I think to yourself: could you tell? Is there some, little hint of madness in the face? The Victorians thought that if you looked like a dog, you behaved like a dog. If you looked like a bull, you behaved like a bull, which is obviously absolute nonsense, but it still goes on today.
So push the button, Kelly. Face reading, Barbara.
Okay, I've dated a lot of losers, and they've all pretended to have money and be big shots when they just are not. And I'm all for a woman being independent and making her own money and being successful, but at the end of the day, I like gifts. So I was wondering, how can I find out if a guy is like wealthy and successful or has potential to be without actually asking him at first?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks for your honesty. That took a little bit to put that out.
She's like, I'm saying I'm a gold digger.
Your shovel, no. Anyway, but there are parts of the face that will reveal wealth. The aspect, though, is because the man might have wealth, though, he might be using it to take care of his elderly parents or put his kids through school, so it might not come to you necessarily, or pay off school loans or something. So, but the parts of the face that show wealth, the nose is the key, and the larger the nose, the more spiritual or financial abundance. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, for example, had a huge nose, so it shows wealth will come to this person. I've looked at a lot of CEOs, looked at 6,000 people and lots of corporations, so that's a really good sign. Also, like President Obama, people who have a very large, wide mouth tend to be generous and affectionate and financially generous. But the features you want to avoid, keep in mind this is a 2,000-year-old system, you want to avoid, if you're looking straight at someone and you can see their nostrils, which is one of the couples before us that are talking about their money issues, there you are. The girl had visible nostrils, and what that means occasionally is money comes in, money goes out. So the other feature that will show people spend a lot of money is when someone's smiling. If you can see their visible gum line, it means they budget and they spend, but mainly they spend. Okay. So just pay attention to those things.
So a gummy smile means that they're a spender. Wow.
Yeah. Mark mentioned spitting image. I saw a few hands go up. So this was a TV program on in the 80s and 90s. And John loves to say that I basically did the whole show single-handedly, but I absolutely didn't at all. I was there the last 2 years of the program. It already had been going 10 years before I turned up, and I was just there almost straight out of college. As a head builder. I was an apprentice head builder. That's me with somebody called Jeremy Clarkson, who one or two people might have heard of. He's very famous in England. He's basically a sort of famous arsehole. And he does Top Gear. It's not Top Gear anymore, but another one of those car programs. That's my boss at the time, Roger Law, who was brilliant. He was a massive, great, big, squarey, amazingly energetic bloke. And I met him a couple of years ago. I was just walking up Charing Cross Road, and I met him. And I went up behind him and said, Roger, I just wanted to say you won't remember who I am. And he didn't remember who I was at all. But I said, you changed my life. And I think it's embarrassing to say almost, because I've never said it to anyone else. I don't think I'll ever say it again, but he really changed my life because he just introduced me to the fact it was possible to have fun and get paid for it at work. Because previous to that, I'd be working at a publisher's, and I just thought that really work was a necessary slog that you had to do every day that just would never be any fun. So he changed all that for me. And my dad, the natural history illustrator guy, had taught Roger, unfortunately, at college. So Roger was always taking the piss out of me for painstakingly doing details, a bit like a natural history drawing, when he one time slapped his hand on my shoulder and said, "This isn't a natural history show." In other words, speed up and look at the broader picture, because on telly, you can't see all these little details. You just want to see the big thing, whatever it is. And that was great advice for someone like me who has a tendency towards fiddling around with little bits. Those were radioactive fish that I made for Spitting Image. I did a lot of eyeballs and blinks. That was just the mechanism. When I first went there, they needed people to fit up the heads so the eyeballs would go like this and the blinks went blub, 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 like that. This is someone called Rolf Harris, who turns out to be a paedophile, but we didn't know at the time. I don't know if anyone knows who Rolf Harris is. His head was just made up of different bits, like the Pope's nose and the Queen Mother's forehead, or various bits that made up Rolf Harris, because he was a very easy person to do, really. They didn't need to sculpt him from scratch, in other words. That's how he appeared on telly. That's a very famous image from Spitting Image. And it really comes from a long tradition of British, I'm sure all around the world, but I think Britain's got a pretty good track record. This is a print by somebody called Gilray, and that Mrs. Thatcher photo was really a kind of a skit on this. And I still do this sort of thing occasionally. This is David Cameron, hot-footing it on the beach. And my Boris Johnson. Boris just made himself. I slapped a pink bit of plasticine on the table, rolled out a couple of sausages for his lips and nose, and stuck a bit of yellow on his head, and there he was, Boris. Just out of interest, that's how he looked as a kid. And I'm embarrassed to show this in front of so many amazing animators, but this is my really, really basic Boris animation. So I just did that with Animate It, which is a tiny little app. I got it on my phone, sellotaped the phone to a bit of bamboo or something, and did this in natural light. And anyway, I normally show that to students, and they're quite impressed, but we'll move on. This is Jeremy Clarkson, who I did for a cover of a magazine. So only did that a year or so ago. So he's still the guy that I showed with me holding his head right at the beginning of Spitting Image, he's still around. So the obvious person, of course, is Donald Trump. Few people have asked me to do to sculpt him, but I just think, what can I add? He's he's caricatured himself. But I have done Melania. And then I, with some hesitancy, did Baron. I want nearly all my portraits to have some sort of sympathy in it, not just total piss takes, but Baron was such an amazingly geeky teenager, gawky geeky teenager. I just couldn't resist making a sculpture of him. I used to do more of this sort of thing. This was an advert for a Japanese clothing brand. I used to spend hours and hours and hours trying to make everything very smooth. And I did these figures for Levi's. This is how they ended up. There was a skinny one for skinny jeans and baggy jeans and regular cut jeans. And they made these figures that went in the sort of point of sale bit. So these figures were kind of collectible things. And they made great big, life-size sort of figures of a similar nature. And I used to make these sort of cast these myself. I don't really bother with much casting anymore because it takes ages and it's very liable to go wrong. That's one called Wounded Knee. This is all about sort of 15 years ago when these sorts of toys, there was a big sort of vogue for these sort of toys, and it's really funny to look back because those sort of things there, I quite like that actually, but when you get to my age, I'm 51, you start to look back and you start to get a feeling of fashion and how things change. And it's actually quite interesting because a lot of my work from 15, 20 years is starting to look very dated. I don't know if it will come back in. You know, you always hope that, you know, things sort of eventually filter through and good things sort of fix. But who knows? There's the collection of the sort of things I was making something like 15 years ago. What happened was, most of these are very sort of smoothly finished, and I just got fed up with people asking me if I'd done them on the computer. So I started making things purposely with the thumbprints and the marks of scalpels and whatever it was, making them as tactile as possible rather than people assuming that I'd done them on the computer. There's Macca. This is Brian May, the guitarist out of Queen. I was really pleased because Matt Lucas, have you heard of a program called Little Britain? He he actually commissioned me to do the Brian May. He's bought quite a lot of my work. And last time, when I took the Brian May to him, I said, I'll come and deliver it. Any chance I can draw you? And he said, yes. So I did that drawing, and he was really sweet about it. Now, I think this is great. Ronaldo, this got so much stick at the time. I think it's a really good portrait and really funny, and just like him, actually. My portrait isn't nearly as good. What I'd love to do, though, is this campy one of Ronaldo. So that's I've got the frame in my studio. I just need to add all the polymer clay. Doggies, I do. This is a dog head that I made a few years ago for a party. It looks particularly funny on children. And to go with the dog, I've got this other character that I do with a friend of mine. It's called MC Tiddles. And my friend Malcolm does the music, and I do the heads and do the performance. And this is MC Tiddles. Cause I'm MC Tiddles, MC Tiddles, MC Tiddles, MC Tiddles. MC Tiddles, look at my face, I'm the best, my rapping is ace. I write the songs, #1 hits, got a sexy face and a big pair of tits. MC Tiddles, MC Tiddles. Come on. I'm a tough pussycat, I got guts. If you don't agree, kick you in the nuts. I'm legendary, never be forgotten. I could stick a whole courgette up my Oopsie Tiddles. Back to doggies. Oh, this is it's really Instagram. Basically my agent told me to start using Instagram about 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. I couldn't be bothered with it at all, but started looking at it, and there are some quite funny things, and then I started getting into it myself. That's one of my favourite ever. And started to really enjoy it. And apart from Roger Law, the other thing that's changed my life is Instagram. And I get people to draw commissions. Nearly all my work comes through Instagram these days, including buying work. I saw these amazing vases that someone had made. Just sent him a message, bought them, and there they are, turned up. It really is for me, it's the key to my modern working life is Instagram. And people's comments are pretty funny. I don't like it. I like this one. I don't like this one. I like this one. She went on and on and on. I like it, but only because of the background. I like that fat one. I don't like it. Grindr. Yeah, just a little. Do you know what Grindr is? One or two people might have heard of it. Anyway, it's a disgusting, filthy app for shagging, basically. Gay shagging. But I used it for getting people to draw. So I got the most amazing number of people volunteering. I just said, I'm looking for models. So I got these amazing guys to strip off and drew them. That was a bit of a one to hold. I mean, the position. But eventually I found my current boyfriend through Grindr, and he posed me for years before anything went on between us. But my last show was a show of drawings of him. And I'll just show you a couple of these. They're quite good fun. So, yeah, this is a show I had. I mean, it's really, for an artist like me that it kind of very much just follows their own path. I get commissioned occasionally. People ask me to draw them or sculpt them and stuff like that. But otherwise, I have a hell of a lot of time where I'm just self-driven, really. So a show once a year is my kind of thing, just to keep me on the rails. It's really good to have a deadline. It's really good to have that sort of focus. So this is a show that I had of those drawings and a launch of the little book that I put together. This is just another little thought. Well, I really respond to this. There is no excellent beauty that hath not some strangeness in the proportion. This is not the Francis Bacon I was talking about earlier, but another one several centuries before. So I think I do my little bit for inclusiveness by being thrilled by big noses and sticking out ears and things like that. I drew a model, a beautiful girl who's an actual model the other day, and she sat down in front of me, and I said, the first thing I've just got to say is that you've got massive, great big sticking out ears. Okay, and they're going to be in the drawing. Is this all okay? And she said, yes, I know. When I was little, my grandma was going to pay to get my ears pinned back. My parents were worried about it. I got teased at school. But now it's made my fortune. So I think sort of as far as models goes, what you see on adverts, that sort of thing. Actually, models have got far more diverse and interesting in their looks. When I was young, it was Cindy Crawford and Elle Macpherson and things like that, who are obviously very beautiful, but actually quite dull. So the range of models you see now is far more interesting. So I'm just finishing up with a few pictures of people that I draw at conferences and things like that, which I'm just going to do after this outside there in the sort of reception bit. If anyone's interested, I'll be sitting there drawing people 30 euros a go, and just 2 chairs, me sitting down, drawing the person in front of me, and it'll take about 15 minutes each. So if anyone's interested in it, just come up and see me afterwards out the front. And this is the sort of thing I'll be doing. Although I don't think there are any children to upset with this sort of drawing. That's it. So if anyone's interested, see you in a minute. Thanks very much.